Hello everybody. I want to welcome you to my C# programming class. Hopefully you have looked at lesson 1 on my website, rkessler.com, and on your 213 page, on your C# page, you should have looked at the first 6 videos that I have on there for you, because even though they were done in Visual Basic, I show you a whole bunch of stuff that will relate to building Windows desktop apps. And it doesn't matter if you're doing Visual Basic, C++, or C# like we are. It's all going to be the same. And so if you have had my VB class before, some of you have, I want you to just sit back and relax for a few minutes, because you should know how to do most of the things I'm going to show today. But what you're interested in learning is the C# syntax. How do you take something and clear a text box? How do you make a button do something? But you're going to have to learn to write it in C# and not Visual Basic or C++. And one of the things that I like to do on our first day demo, I call it, or first night demo, is I like to show you a little project I made that gives you an idea of what we're going to work on for the next few weeks. I'm in Visual Studio 2015, and I want to just let me run this first. And you see a little form comes up, and we call it Ron Sporting Goods. And I'm going to put in name in here into this text box. Now, when you want to get data from somebody, from a customer, from your friend, whatever, on a Windows app, you're going to use a text box control. The box you see down here is something called a list box. And we're going to work with those in a later lesson, not today, but I just wanted to show you kind of where we're headed here. And what you do is you can add items to the list box, and they can sort the list box. And then when they pick an item, we can do something with it. So for example, if I were to put in my name like I did, and I hit the print button, notice up here a little message comes up. It's kind of like a receipt that says, hey, thanks Bob Anderson for shopping at my store, buy more next time. No matter what I put in here, let me change it to Karen, it will do the same thing. It will insert that person's name, put in a space between the first and last name, and put a little sentence there for them. And we use this, and that's why I'm showing it to you. That box that you see up here is called a label control, and I make it look like it is using a 3D outline or a 3D border style, so that my students can see that there's something on there. Instead of trying to print to the printer and wasting paper and all that, we just print out our receipts as an output to one of these little labels like that. Okay, sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small, so that's what those are. The other thing I want to show you that we'll work on down the road just a little is when you start working with the list box, you're going to want to edit the items. So I had a little box here, another little text box, and if I say that we're going to sell apples at my sporting goods store, for some reason, I can say add the items, and it will add apples. If I want to delete that, if I decide I don't want apples, I can just hit the delete button. Now here's what I want you to get a feel for if you haven't done this before. First of all, this thing you're looking at is something called a Windows form. They also have web forms that work the similar way that you would use on a web application through the internet, work through your browser. But here's what I want you to kind of get a feel for. We're using something called object-oriented programming, and that means that most of the time our application is just sitting there, like mine is right now, doing nothing until someone interacts with it. And I want to show you, if I take this out of Visual Studio and I just show it to you on my desktop where I can move it around, it's a fully fledged Windows application. You could build one for the phone, you can build one for robots, you can do all kinds of cool stuff, tablets. But these we're just focusing on this semester and just with the desktop. But I wanted to point out to you that nothing really happens until someone interacts with it. So when someone types in something, I'll just type in a bunch of junk and hit add item, notice that the program doesn't do anything until I actually click on that button. Now the only reason that this works is because I wrote code that I'll show you in a minute that says when they click on add item, I want you to take what's in this text box, I want you to add it to the list box. And you see, I just can keep doing that because I didn't tell it not to do duplicate. On the other hand, if I click the print button, it's going to take their name, and I'll change it again just so you can see. It's going to take their name, first name, last name, put a space in the middle, and then add this little sentence here so that I can show them a little receipt. If they click on an item in the list box, I hit delete, it's going to delete that item. If I hit clear, it clears the entire form and it puts the blinking cursor up here. Here's the point. Every time they click on the print button, that activates a feature. I made up the feature. You can make yours do whatever you want. It's no different than playing a video game, and every time you push the up arrow key, it moves your spaceship up the screen. If you hit the space bar, it shoots rockets at it. You as the programmer get to decide what it is your app's going to do. But what we're doing here in object-oriented programming is we assign instructions to a particular object, and then when our user clicks on it or moves over it with the mouse, then something happens. Until then, nothing really happens. All right. Now, the last one is a simple one, of course. The quit button in this case doesn't ask you, are you sure you want to quit? But at some point in the semester, we will look at them and say, hey, do you sure you want to quit? And we'll put a yes, no button on here. But for right now, this thing, when I hit quit, it just closes the form, and that closes your application in Visual Studio. Now, a quick tour and a quick reminder, I hope, is that when you open up an application from my website, or you want to build your own, it will open up in Visual Studio like this, and it may or may not have any of these windows. That's why I'm going to do this for you. And sometimes when you build something at home and you bring it to the classroom and you open it up, it looks like this, and you have a heart attack. And I'm going to have to give you an anti-anxiety medication or something, because you think, oh my God, I worked on this for days, and where is it? Here's where it is. Don't freak out. There's a couple ways to get to this. You may or may not have these little goober icons here, but if you do, you can click on the one that says Solution Explorer. There's also one here for the toolbox. If yours doesn't, because you can add and remove things from this toolbar, you go up here to the View menu and you say Solution Explorer. Now there's a whole bunch of Explorer things up here that you can see. We've got Team Explorer, Server Explorer, SQL Server, Object Explorer. Don't pick any of those pups. You want Solution Explorer, and it brings up this little window. Inside this pane is all of the pieces and parts that go with your little application. And even though it's a dumb little application I made, there are tons and tons of files, and there are hundreds of lines of C# programming code that made that little cheesy thing work. Okay, so this is where all your stuff is. The form I made is, I'm going to close this up. The form I made by default is going to say form1.cs, and the CS stands for C#. In C++, it'll say CPP, and in Visual Basic, it says VB. So make sure, you guys that have had VB, make sure when you create a new project for me this semester, you pick the C# project. Otherwise, you're going to be starting over, because you cannot build a Visual Basic application and start writing C# code in it, or vice versa. If you want to see your form that you were working on, you come back in here and you just double click where it says Form 1, and now you have your form. When I'm in this mode, it's called Design Mode, and I can then change things around. I can change the form, I can move buttons here, I can go into the toolbox, I can double click and bring up another button, just like that. I can resize it, I can change what it says. I showed you how to do all that in the first set of videos, so that should be easy for you to do at this point. When you decide you don't want a control on the form, you made a mistake, or you change your mind, I just click on it one time. Don't be double clicking, single click, and I just hit the delete key on the keyboard. You can also right click and delete it. All right. Now for this class, we're only going to be using applications that have one form, but you can have multiple forms. That's what you're used to when you do stuff on the web. That's what you're used to in doing stuff on Windows and phone apps. You have multiple forms, different pages of things. But this one, we're just going to stick to one. All right. Now, what I'd like to do is to show you very simply what this code does and how I made it behave the way it did. And then we're going to move on to data entry part 1, which is another project. And I will show you how to build it. And we're going to build it together from scratch. And I want you to build it along with me on your computer. You pause the video and you do it with me. But very quickly, let's do this. I told you that, and from the other videos you saw, when you want to build an app like this, the first thing you have to do is build a GUI, graphical user interface, so a customer can interact with your project. After you get things moved around, and it doesn't mean you're stuck there, you can move them around anytime you want, you have to make sure that your program is sitting here in design mode, that it's not running. When you want to test your program, the easiest thing is to push the F5 function the little F5 function key on your keyboard. Now I'm going to stop it for a second and show you one other thing. You can click the start button up here. See this guy? Does the same thing. In this particular case, I told my form to start up in the center of the screen just because I think it looks better, and I want you guys to do that too. I changed what the form said. It was normally say Form 1, which looks pretty amateurish. So I just changed it to say Ron Sporting Goods. You can pick whatever you want. And then I changed these labels so that they said first name, last name, and I changed the names of all these buttons and renamed them so that I could work with them in code. Right now we're in run mode, and this is how you test your program. So you build it in design mode, you add your code, and you run it. You kind of cross your fingers, hope that it works. If this doesn't work, it'll tell you there's an error, and we'll figure out what's wrong with it. But if it pops up like this, chances are it's probably going to work just fine. When you want to make changes, you quit, and if your quit button isn't wired up, you're not coded, haven't coded it yet, you can either click the X on your form, or you can go up here and click this stop button just like on a DVD player. I never use pause or break from this, so just use the start and stop. Now that I'm back here, I can make changes. What I want to do is show you how I made these things work. Let's start first of all with the quit button. The easiest thing to learn in programming when you're first starting out. How do I quit one of these things? How do I make this application stop? Well, you have to be able to write instructions so when they click on this quit button, it will make the program do something, make the computer do something. Here's the easiest way to do that. When you want to write code that's attached to the quit button, in this case, just double click the quit button like this, and Visual Studio will make you a place where you can write your code. Now I'm going to hit the control key and scroll down on my mouse so I can make this bigger for you, but I want to come down here to where it says quit. Okay, let's move the rest of this out of the way. What happened when I double clicked it, it made what is called a click event or an event handler. It's also sometimes called a subroutine. There's three different names they go by, but event handler is kind of what we use. What that means is when someone clicks on that button, it triggers an event. Now, event is what happens in the operating system, and it's just like when you guys are in class and you raise your hand to ask me a question. If I'm in the middle of talking, you're going to raise your hand and I see your hand. I probably can't just stop what I'm saying and go answer your question, but you triggered something in my mind to know, okay, I got to go and I need to respond to you. That's how the computer works. So when someone clicks on the button, it sends a message to Windows itself. It's called an event. And it's like a to-do list. It goes to the computer and says, hey, when you get a chance, would you go in and see what you're supposed to do when Ron, on Ron's program, when you click the button, he's going to want you to do something. Go see what you have to do. So it says, okay, I'll be right there. So it stops what it's doing and it goes in and says, okay, when they click on the button, I'm supposed to come in here to this block of code and do something. Now in C#, a couple things to keep in mind. Everything you type in your C# code is case sensitive, so a capital C is not the same as a lowercase c, and so you have to be very careful. Most of your errors are going to be in spelling or in capitalization. When you come in here to this thing, there is a block of code that is identified by these little braces. You have to be careful that you always have a left-hand brace and a right-hand brace. What goes in here, in between this section, is any instructions you want to have happen when someone clicks the button. Now here's how you close a C# application. You type in, I'm going to do it from scratch here. I'm going to highlight that and just hit the backspace or delete, get rid of it. When you want to close an application in C#, the first thing you do is type in the word this. Now I recommend that you always start typing in lowercase, because look what happens. This little cheat sheet comes up. This is wonderful. This is called IntelliSense. And what you want to do is you want to pick the thing on this list and let it put it in for you, because that way you're guaranteed that the spelling will be correct and the capitalization will be correct. Here's what I do. I find the thing I want and I hit the tab key on the keyboard. I don't use a space bar, I use a tab. And it pops it in, okay? Would you make a note, this refers to the form itself. In Visual Basic, we use the word me. In C#, C++, we use the word this. So you have to put this. And then you say, well, what do I want this to do? What do I want the form to do? Well, what you do in object-oriented programming is you type in the name of the object you're working with, text box, button, list box, whatever, and then you do a dot. And the IntelliSense comes up and says, hey, there's a lot of things you can do with a form. You can do something if it's activated. Look at all these things on here. You can change its back color. So I could change the background color. We'll do that in another project. I can come down here and I can center the screen, center it into the screen, do all kinds of stuff. What I want to do is I just want to close the darn thing. So I'm going to type in CLO, because I know that's what it is. And there it is, and notice it's a capital C. I'm not going to obsess over it. I'm going to hit the Tab key and let it pop it in. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. I showed you in other videos, when you change what a button says, let me go over here. When you change what the button says, I change it to quit, you are changing one of its characteristics, which is the same thing as a property. We call them properties. When you want to change something on one of these controls, you click on it one time, no double clicking, and push the F4 key. Okay, you got to remember that. And you'll notice over here now I have another little window. And it says, oh my gosh, look at all these things I can change. Well, I can change what the button says by changing its text property. So make a note, text property on all these controls is what they display or show up as on the screen. That's what the person's going to see. So I just typed in quit. That's what I wanted it to say. I could say exit, just by saying type in exit, and then I hit enter to kind of lock it in, and now the button says exit. Okay, all by itself. It centers by itself. You don't have to do anything like that. You can change the font, you can change the colors, you can do all kinds of stuff, but that's all I want to do. The other thing that you want to learn to do, though, is before you start coding, you want to name your controls. And when you're working with buttons, we have a system that we use, and the professional programmers have decided that's what they want. Well, every time you use a button, we want to use a prefix called BTN, all lowercase. And then you can put in quit or exit or whatever you want. Don't ever have spaces in the names of your controls, okay? No spaces. And do it like this. So you see BTN, then lowercase quit. Now, when you change these are called properties, and properties are like characteristics. The name property and the text property are the two properties that get beginning students absolutely messed up and screwed up. The text property, all it does is change what the button says on screen. That's all it does. The name property is what you and I are going to use to refer to this and manage this button and make it do something for us in our C# code or VB code or C++ code. Doesn't matter. Okay, you'll see why in a minute. So you always, you guys want to rename all your controls properly before you start coding. BTNs for buttons. When we do text boxes, I want them to all start with TXT, and then you can say TXT first name, TXT last name, whatever you want. TXT zip, you can call them whatever you want. Labels start with LBL, and here I had LBL receipt. The R should have been capitalized, but I messed up. List boxes, you start with LB for list box, and I usually call mine LB items, list box items. These are the names that we're going to refer to these controls with in our programming code. Our customer never sees it, your grandma doesn't see it, your friend doesn't see it, they don't care about it, they don't know how this works, they just want to see what you're doing, and they want to support you in your efforts because it's a lot of work. So remember, name property and text property, two very different things. You've got to get used to those. Now, in order to make it do something, again, you double click on this and you come down to this event handler here where this guy is. Now, you'll notice that when we change the text property or the name property or the font, those characteristics are like nouns when you're working in English. They're not action words, they're descriptors. But a word like close or jump or do or focus or clear, remove, add, all those words, they're like verbs. And so they're like action words, and we call those methods. Now this is true again in Visual Studio. It's VB, C#, C++, doesn't matter. In Visual Basic, if I were to type in me.close here in a Visual Basic app and hit enter, Visual Studio would put in these two little parentheses for me. In C# it doesn't. You have to remember you're going to do a lot of stuff more manually in C# and C++ than you do in Visual Basic. So after the close, you're going to put in two empty rounded parentheses, and then you're going to see that it says there's something wrong here because I have this little red hoochie thing, and it's showing me that it was expecting a semicolon. Okay, so these things, if you hover over them with the mouse, they try to help you and show you what's going wrong. When you're finished with a line of code in C# and C++, you have to end the line with a semicolon. That's called a line termination character. If you don't do that, it won't know that that's the end of the line. And you don't do it on every line of code, but you do it any time you're telling the computer, hey, do something. Okay? So when you see a word like close, do, add, focus, those kind of things, I want you to think, okay, those are action words. Those are methods, and Ron said they have to have the rounded parentheses. Don't use square brackets, don't use braces, rounded parentheses. And on a test or quiz, if I showed you this and I said, what is close? Is it a property or method? Even if you don't quite remember what they are, you might think, oh, it's got those little rounded parentheses after them, and so it must be a method, because those are the only times we use those for actions. Now what's going to happen is when someone clicks on this button that I called BTN quit, the computer is going to come in here onto this line of code, and it's going to execute that line of code. And that will effectively close out your C# application. So that means it'll be back in Visual Studio in design mode, and you can do whatever you want with it. You can save it, make changes, whatever you want. Okay? If there was more lines of code, it would do it. Remember, the computer does one miserable line of code at a time. It just can do it super fast. Let's take another quick example. When I made the clear button do something, I double-clicked on the clear button, and I named him BTN clear. And I want you to take note of some things here, because we're going to be using these a lot. You use them a million times in your career. If you want to clear a text box, you type in the name of your text box, and then you do a dot, and you type in clear. Now clear is going to show up on your IntelliSense, but this is how you clear all text boxes. Whatever the name of your text box is, you can do dot clear. Now that doesn't erase it. All that does is clear the stuff out of the text box so they can type something new. That's what it really means. And I did that for these three text boxes. Please make a note that when you're working with labels, any kind of label, you cannot say, like here, I can't say LBL receipt dot clear. I have to say LBL receipt dot text equals, and then you see two parentheses. What that, or two apostrophes. What that means is, I'm sorry, not apostrophes, they're double quotes. You see two double quotes. It's like, that says take whatever's in that label and mush it down to nothing. That's what that is like, okay? No space, no nothing. And that will erase what's in a label. Now the reason you have to do this, because Microsoft did not make a method called clear that works with labels. Okay? So you just need to remember that and get used to that. I will also tell you that you can change or erase a text box by also doing the same thing. I could have said txt first dot text equals two double quotes. Would do the same thing. That's what we did for years. They added this several years ago, but they did not add one for the label. Now the last thing I told it to do, after it clears the first box, then it'll clear the next box, and it just does it, you know, just in a few thousandths of a second. And then it clears the label. And then the last thing here that I wanted to teach you is something called focus. This also is a method. You can see it's kind of like an action word, and it's got two little parentheses. And that says go to the txt first text box right here after you hit the clear button. And I want the blinking cursor to show up in that text box so that they can type again. Okay, so again, when I hit clear, it's going to do this, it's going to do this, it's going to do this, and finally do this. And it will do each one of those in order, and then it'll sit there and not do anything until someone does something again. Again, object-oriented programming. It's not going to do a thing because there's no instruction to tell it to do anything. Now what you have to remember is, if you haven't done it before, When you create an event handler like this for a button or whatever, you can tell it to do whatever you want. You can make it go out to a website and open the browser. You can make it play song. You can make it play video. You can do whatever you want. Okay, but we have to start off gentle. We have to start off easy, and that's why I want to give you this first kind of introduction to this whole process before we move on to the other lessons. The other thing is, I will show you at some point how I said, hey, thanks, Bob Anderson, for shopping at my store. And you can see that what I basically did is I put in a sentence here, and then I just inserted what was in their first name text box plus what was in the second name text, their last name, and I added a little space. But we'll get some practice doing that. I also will show you how to remove and clear items from a list box. I'll also show you how to take items from a text box and add them to the items collection inside of a list box when we talk about list boxes. Okay, so when you look at your whole code window, this is called a code window. You can see that I went up to the top and I wanted to put in a title for myself so you know what you were looking at. In C#, when you want to make a comment, like I did here, you put in 2 forward slashes. The computer then makes that all look green, and it completely ignores it. And this is a very, very good habit to get into, and I definitely want to see you do this when you turn in your homework or do any project with me. You put in a comment before the code so you'll remember what it was for when you come back and look at it in 6 months, because even though it seems obvious today, it may not be obvious in 6 months, especially when you get to harder applications. Okay, so up here all I did was I made some space and I just put in this section here. Now if you want to have a whole block of comments instead of putting double slashes on all of them, you can start one with a backslash and an asterisk, and then I do an asterisk and a backslash, and from here to here this is all comments. That's why it's green, and the computer will ignore it. So you put in when you created it, when you updated it. These are like notes for you. No one sees it unless you give it to give them your project. Now one last thing I want to say before we quit. This whole thing that you're looking at is called source code. And I don't care if you write it in Java, Python, C, C++, Lego programming language, it doesn't matter. This is all called source code. And this is what makes your application or your game, your project work. This is what you want to protect. If someone gets this source code, they have stolen your project. So this is what you want to protect if you're building something that you want to sell or market in some way. Okay? All right. Now that we've had kind of an intro to this and you've kind of got a feel, I hope, of how you build your projects by writing some code, designing it first, and then writing some code in here and then pushing the F5 key and testing it. When you don't like what you want, or if it's not doing what you want, then you stop it. You always have to stop. You go back in and make changes. You have 2 tabs up here with this form. One of them says design, and that's where you build this, and the other one is where you write your code. If they're not there, don't sweat. You double click on your form, and then you can do one of 2 things. You can click on your form here and just right click and say view code, or usually there's a little doodad over here in Solution Explorer. This little guy, let me close this. See that funny bracket thing? That will turn on your code window so that you can write programming code. When your program runs, it mushes all these things together into one Windows application, and then the operating system takes over, and voila, you have a fully functional Windows app. All right, that's all for this time.